Throughout the history of pre-modern Japan, the samurai warrior class would come to dominate the country in all things military, despite the fact that they were not the only types of warriors that would come to exist within the country, with other examples being that of the ashigaru, lower class foot soldiers who would truly rise to prominence during the years of the Sengoku period, and of course militant groups of armed monks that today often get referred to as sohei. But one type of almost elusive warrior group within Japan that has become increasingly popular over the years is that of female warriors, who many simply call female samurai. This is what we are going to be finally diving into here today. Yet before we go any further, I need to mention that this video is once again part of the monthly collaborative series I'm doing alongside channels Samurai and Ninja History, Sengoku Studies, and Samurai Traditions of the Tada Genji. We are all covering the interesting topic of female Japanese warriors this month, so check out the description below to see links to the other great videos. But with that said, let's dive in. So, no doubt most of you have probably seen or heard about female warriors in pre-modern Japan. The image of a female in the typical male role of the samurai warrior is one that has definitely caught on over the years. We've seen them in movies, anime, manga, and of course games, but the question still remains, are these depictions accurate? Were there really female samurai warriors? Well, yes, but also no. What it really comes down to is how we contextualize it. So before we do anything else, we should first look to define simply what a samurai was, and then look to see how women fit into that concept. Historically, professional warriors in pre-modern Japan were known as bushi, and of course, the bushi would come to develop into their own class in Japanese society. A class that existed sort of beneath the official nobility and above the commoners. I actually made a whole video about the odd gray zone between the samurai and nobility, which you should really check out if you want to learn more about that. But basically, the bushi, who would come to be more widely known as samurai, those who serve, would eventually become their own land-holding warrior class in old Japan. Yet although this is where the warrior class sort of sat in our idea of the social hierarchy of pre-modern Japan, what were gender roles like within the class itself? It should not be too hard to realize that the role of the warrior itself was one that was male-dominated, as boys born into the samurai class were raised to become men who could both fight and govern. This would remain true for the entirety of pre-modern Japanese history, the era we today like to generalize as feudal Japan. So, what then of the women who were born into the samurai class? What was their role? Well, their main purpose would be to act as wives, mothers, keepers of the house, and of course even concubines. But there are also rare occasions where women could be designated to inherit full leadership of families, making them some of the most prominent female figures in the country for their time. However, as a whole, women of the samurai class often get seen as more political objects. Individuals you give to another lord or samurai to ensure their loyalty or to help raise children and maintain a home. Many examples can be seen of this throughout Japanese history, with prime examples being from each of the three great unifiers, who all treated the women in their lives as tools, with which to either build or maintain alliances or to have more children. Oda Nobunaga gave his sister Oichi away to Azai Nagamasa in order to form an alliance between their clans. The same thing had even happened to Nobunaga himself, as he had previously come to be wed to Nohime, the daughter of Saito Dosan, to build a bond between their families. Later, Toyotomi Hideyoshi would resort to using concubines instead of his wife in hopes of having a long-desired son to carry on his family name to succeed him. And like Nobunaga, he would also marry his sisters off to other prominent lords as well in order to maintain their loyalty and cement his position. And then of course there is Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would end up having to order the execution of his first wife after she became suspected of treason against Oda Nobunaga, thus leaving Ieyasu with little choice other than to have her dealt with in order to maintain his relations with the Oda. And of course, like the other two, he would also go on to marry off his sisters, daughters, granddaughters, and even adopted daughters. Toyotomi Hideyori, the son of Hideyoshi, would even come to be wed to Senhime, Tokugawa Ieyasu's granddaughter, and daughter of the second shogun of the Tokugawa Shogunate, Tokugawa Hidetada. But just because women of the samurai class were treated in such a way does not mean that from time to time some were not able to achieve tremendous amounts of power and influence themselves. As I mentioned earlier, women could come to dominate entire clans, either through direct control by being designated heir, or by having the ears of the men, particularly being counsel to their husbands, and obviously mothers to sons. Now, it should be noted though that the influence of women did drastically decline over time, and that by the Edo period there were even works like the Onna Daigaku being written, which served to educate women on the subservient role they should all play in pre-modern Japanese society, from very much a Confucian point of view. However, before that point there were still a number of significant female figures who would come to hold vast amounts of influence. One only needs to look at a figure like Hojo Masako, wife of the first shogun of the Kamakura Shogunate, Minamoto no Yoritomo, who later would come to establish a commanding grip herself, even coming to be known as the Nun Shogun after the death of her husband. Another famous example of a significant female is that of Yoro Dono, concubine to Toyotomi Hideyoshi and mother of Hideyori. Many believe that she was instrumental in the fostering of resentment within Hideyori towards Tokugawa Ieyasu, all of which would later come to result in some of the largest clashes in samurai history at Osaka throughout late 1614 and into 1615. However, in all of these examples so far, one key element to the popular image of the female samurai is missing, that being the actual role of being a woman warrior. So, did female members of the samurai class fight just like the men? If they were part of the warrior class, wouldn't it make sense that they too would be on the front lines alongside other samurai? Unfortunately, for those of you hoping for this to be true, in most situations the answer appears to be no. Yet also, it would not be uncommon for women born into the samurai class to receive some martial arts and weapon training as well. In some cases, it is also believed that a prominent female figure might also keep an entourage of armed maidens with her as well as a form of personal guard. However, these women of the samurai class did not fight on the front lines of field battles, and women seem to be hardly ever present on campaigns, which raises the question of, well, if they were trained, in what situations would they fight? Remember, at this point in time, the woman's place was at home, and thus there are many stories of female members of the samurai class who would gear up and participate in the defense of their home. This means that the most common place one would likely see a female warrior engaging in combat would likely have been during a siege. Now, this does not mean that this often occurred, or is the way in which female fighters would always present themselves throughout Japanese history, but this does seem to be a consistent trend for what we do know about the women who actually fought. These female warriors have come to be referred to as either Onna Musha, meaning simply woman warrior, or in some cases Onna Bugeisha, which means something more like woman martial artist. And although there are several interesting examples of women warriors I want to highlight, the most important thing I first want to ask, and probably the most important question of this entire video is it accurate to refer to these women as female samurai? To be honest, I think the answer lies in semantics. If you are referring to an Onna Musha or an Onna Bugeisha as simply a female member of the samurai class, then absolutely, I think calling them a female samurai would be logical. But the word samurai itself has its own myriad of implications that make it a bit problematic past this point. The common conception of a samurai is one that is male-oriented. The warrior image of the samurai is that of a man. It was men that were typically, albeit with a few exceptions, the ones to lead families and armies, and it was they who enjoyed all the social privileges that came with being of the male gender. Of course, as we know, the concept of gender in pre-modern Japan did not really exist in entirely the same way we think of it today. But when we simply put it into the idea of what males of the samurai class were capable of versus what females were, there is a definite difference. It's as I explained earlier, the common idea of the male samurai was to lead and fight, while the female was to keep a home, raise children, and be of good counsel to her husband. To further understand the difference, one only needs to look at what might happen to a samurai should they become unemployed. While a male would become an out-of-work ronin, they would still display their samurai status by maintaining their top knot and continuing to carry the daisho, 2 swords, which would be mandated during the Edo period. They would of course need to seek new employment as either a warrior or later a bureaucrat of sorts. The same cannot be said for female members of the samurai class, who if they found themselves no longer part of a prominent or landholding family, they would not be ones necessarily to still carry weapons, and would need to seek other employment that would befit a woman of the times. Now, I am aware that there are some late Edo period photos of women with swords, but it's hard to judge the authenticity of those, as they might just be staged, as many photos in Japan were at the time. For example, these three guys might not actually be real samurai. In fact, I'd argue that they are instead probably just common people who put on some armor and took a photo for a tourist. That's not saying that all photos at the time were staged, but a lot were, which can be kinda hard to go back and look at them. This might actually be a really fun topic for its own video at some point. But getting back to female samurai, so at least going off of what we know, and it is possible that maybe there could have been rare exceptions, but when we do think about it contextually, there really were not any women who operated within the same warrior identity as their male counterparts. Besides the fact that, yes, as we are about to get into, there were still women who did fight on occasion. So who are these women? There have been several over the years who have become famous for the role they played and the impact they left. In fact, many more ideas of female warriors would start to emerge during the Edo period, as popular, often heavily embellished, stories of warrior maidens of the past started to rise. But the three examples I want to briefly discuss here are ones that I'm sure each of you have heard of. The first being Tomoe Gozin. Tomoe Gozin, or Lady Tomoe, was a popular figure of the Genpei War, a female warrior who served Minamoto no Yoshinaka, the treacherous Minamoto lord who had come to face off against his own cousin, Minamoto no Yoritomo. It is believed that she was actually a favored concubine of Yoshinaka, who would go on to then serve him in his actual war effort. She appears in the Heike Monogatari, also known as the Tale of the Heike. However, there is really not a lot of solid evidence out there about her, besides stories that have arisen over the years. Many have even come to speculate if she even existed at all, while others have simply challenged the notion that she was a warrior. However, the popular image of Tomoe Gozen has become probably the most iconic of all the female warriors to ever emerge in pre-modern Japan, from her long flowing hair, beautiful face, ornate armor, and of course, her naginata. As a side note, the usage of the naginata is one that is often attributed to Tomoe Gozen and other female warriors, but this idea may not have actually arisen until the Edo period, when more artwork and stories of female warriors was on the rise. For Tomoe Gozen, images of her with a naginata might have been done simply to depict her better within the old Heian period. But on a wider note, the naginata itself may have become increasingly viewed as more of a woman's weapon in general throughout the Edo period as well. This makes it a bit difficult to actually discern if the naginata was truly a weapon female warriors favored or not. But getting back to Tomoe Gozen's story, it is said that her martial prowess won the respect of her lover Yoshinaka, who then allowed her to take part in his military campaigns, even allowing her to lead troops. Stories go on to say that she would continue to impress on the battlefield, slaying a number of notable samurai through the course of the Genpei War. And although Yoshinaka would come to be defeated and killed, her own fate remains a bit of a mystery. The next example I want to look at is one you might be very familiar with if you have played the Samurai Warriors series. This figure being that of Tachibana Ginchio. Unlike Tomoe Gozen, we can accurately say that Tachibana Ginchio did indeed exist. Ginchio would become one of the rare examples of a woman being designated head of a family, when her father Tachibana Dosetsu would decide he wanted her to inherit leadership. She would later be wed to the son of Takahashi Jon, a man who would later adopt the name Tachibana Muneshige, but it is said the two of them would eventually separate. Stories say that Ginchio would arm and train an entourage of maidens that accompanied her, and this is even believed to have left an impact on Toyotomi Hideyoshi. However, her real notable role as a warrior came during the Sekigahara conflict. It was here both Ginchio and Muneshige would side with the pro-Toyotomi Western Army, and they would both be forced to defend their home in Kyushu. It was here Ginchio would face threats from Tokugawa loyalists such as Kato Kiyomasa and Kuroda Kanbei. It is said that she and her maidens prepared to be placed under siege at Yanagawa, and that when an attack finally came, she suited up in armor and is believed to have actually fought. Ultimately, she would survive the conflict, but being that she had been on the losing side overall, she would live out the short remainder of her life in confinement. Nevertheless, her role at the top of the family, her insistence on her armed group of maidens, and her bravery during the Sekigahara conflict all paint the picture of a fascinating and inspiring female warrior. But the final example I want to share is not one woman, but rather a group of women. These were the women of Aitsu domain. During the final months of the Boshin War, as the pro-imperialist forces marched on one of the last bastions of shogunal support, they would look to crush that of the Matsudaira of Aitsu. It was here that the shogunate loyalist forces of Aitsu would fight hard to defend their home. But it was also here that a group of Aitsu women would come to fight heroically against the invaders as well. Not only did these women help support their male counterparts by making ammunition, caring for the wounded, and helping move and acquire supplies, but when it came time for battle, they would be on the front lines. Sadly, Aitsu domain would ultimately be crushed by the imperialist forces, but the story of these brave female warriors lives on, and is possibly the most well-documented story of all warrior women in pre-modern Japan. So, as you can see, female warriors of the samurai class definitely did exist in old Japan. It's just that the conception of them may need to be tweaked a bit for some people. Although they never really encompassed the same role as that of their male counterparts within the samurai class, they instead took on other roles that were still highly significant, and even then, when desperate times called for them to take up arms, it would not be unheard of that they would. This creates an interesting identity for these female warriors of the samurai class, who are pretty unique in the grand sense of warrior cultures, and in particular female warriors throughout history. But with that said, if you want to learn more about female warriors in pre-modern Japan, don't forget to check out the videos made in collaboration with this one from the other great channels you see on screen now. And thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.